If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. This is just a reminder that this podcast has merch and a Patreon, and if you could contribute to one of those to help keep this podcast going, I would greatly appreciate it. Hi, Courtney here. I make a small mistake in this episode. In this episode, I mention a woman named Elizabeth Vernon, and I say that her husband was William Herbert, but her husband was actually Henry Risley. I just misspoke, and I didn't catch it whenever I was editing the episode. So whenever you get to the part where I'm talking about Elizabeth Vernon, just know that her husband was not William Herbert, and it was actually Henry Risley. Alright, that's all. To be or not to be? That is a question that the title character in William Shakespeare's play Hamlet asks. And Hamlet has caused scholars and readers alike to ask the question, did Hamlet go insane or not? And the writer himself, William Shakespeare, has also left behind some mysteries that have scholars asking some questions. One of which is, was William Shakespeare bisexual? Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 4th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled, They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was a part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that during their time, they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So while I fully believe that those who were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserve to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So obviously some of these subjects would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using. But I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that in their time there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are a rainbow. And for this week, I am talking about William Shakespeare. William was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, England. The town is commonly just known as Stratford. He was born in April of 1564, that much is known for certain. William's birthday is celebrated on April 23rd. That is because William was baptized on April 26th. Baptisms usually happened 3 days after the birth. Parents were instructed by the prayer book that their child should be baptized no later than the first Sunday after their birth. April 23rd landed on a Sunday in 1564, so it is very unlikely that William was born before then. William's father was named John Shakespeare, and he was married to William's mother, Mary Arden. Together, John and Mary had 8 children. Their children were Joan, Margaret, William, Gilbert, another Joan, Anne, Richard, and Edmund. By the time that William was born, both his older sisters had already passed away. So William grew up as the oldest child. John was a glove maker and he held several political offices in his lifetime. And because of this, he probably was able to send his children, including William, to grammar school. King's New School was probably where William was educated. But John did eventually fall on hard times when William was growing up. Remember that. That is going to play a role much later on in this story. No one knows how John fell on hard times, but he did. But a few years before John's death, John was able to repair his status, probably because of William's success. It is clear that William's childhood influenced the career path that William took. His education first started at home with his mother, Mary. Mary was literate, and she would tell stories to William, and later those stories influenced William's work as a writer. While he probably did go to grammar school, he for sure did not go to university. When William was 18 years old, he married a woman named Anne Hathaway. No, not the actress. Anne was probably 26 when they married. Their marriage license was issued on November 27, 1582. After the wedding, Anne moved into William's house with his family. Together, William and Anne had 3 children. Their first child was a daughter named Susanna, and she was baptized on May 26, 1583. And then they had twins, a daughter named Judith and a son named Hamnet. And they were baptized on February 2nd, 1585. Now, if you're doing the math in your head and you're going, wait a minute, November 27th, 1582 and May 26th, 1583 are less than 40 weeks from each other. Yes, you were right. Anne Hathaway was pregnant when she married William Shakespeare. Now, it could have been possible that William and Anne had a hand fasting ceremony. A hand fasting ceremony is basically like a wedding. In a lot of cultures, hand fasting is as good as a wedding ceremony. And once you have had a hand fasting ceremony, you are married. So, sex would not have been seen as a sin if you would have had a hand fasting ceremony. Usually, hand fasting ceremonies took place on August 1st. So it's possible that William and Anne had a hand fasting ceremony and Anne got pregnant pretty much immediately after. If someone did get pregnant after a hand fasting ceremony, then they would quickly have a wedding ceremony before the signs of pregnancy were visible. Either way, William and Anne did get married in a hurry, so obviously they knew that Anne was pregnant. Not much is known about William and Anne's relationship. The only other thing that we know about William and Anne is William left Anne his second best bed in his will. Some have seen this as an insult, but this would have been their marriage bed, and this was a common thing for men to leave their wives. William's best bed would have been the guest bed, and that usually went to the heir. So that would have went to his daughter Susanna. After the birth of his twins in 1585 to 1592, there is a gap where we don't know what happened in William's life. These are known as the lost years. In 1592 is when William pops up in the London theatre scene. Now, many researchers have tried and failed to find documentation to fill in those gap years. Though lack of documentation has not stopped people from speculating about what led William to leave his home and take up acting in London. Local legend has it in Stratford that William had poached a deer from Sir Thomas Lucy's estate, and he fled to London to avoid punishment. During these gap years, William could have worked as a lawyer's clerk, or he could have been a soldier. He may have been living out a simple life by helping out the family business, or he could have joined an acting company that visited Stratford. Some have suggested that William was a schoolmaster, and others have suggested that he started his career in theater by mending the horses of theater patrons in London. Not only was William acting in plays in 1592, but he was also writing them. When William started out, he was very much an underdog. I know it is hard to think the William Shakespeare as an underdog, but he was seen as one because he didn't go to university like most of the playwrights of his time did. Playwrights like Christopher Marlowe and Thomas Nash, also the playwright Robert Greene. Robert actually attacked William in Robert's published pamphlet, Groat's Worth of Wit. In the pamphlet, he said, quote, "There is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johannes factotum, is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country." End quote. Basically, what Robert was saying was William was reaching above his rank. But you know what? I guarantee more people are familiar with William Shakespeare's works today than they are Robert Greene's. After 1594, William's plays were only performed by Lord Chamberlain's men. That was a theater company that was owned by William and other players. The name of the company would change to the King's Men when King James I and VI took the throne. In August of 1596, tragedy struck. William's son Hamnet died. The cause of Hamnet's death was never recorded. It could have been the bubonic plague, but like I said, we don't know for sure. On August 11th, 1596, Hamnet was buried in the churchyard at Holy Trinity in Stratford. We don't know if William was able to make it back to Stratford for the funeral, but many have pointed out that William expressed his grief for his son in his play King John. This is a quote from the play King John. It is Act 3, Scene 4, and the character Constance is speaking. Quote, "Grief fills the room up of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts on his pretty looks, repeats his words, remembers me of all his gracious parts, stuffed out his vacant garments with his form. Then have I reason to be fond of grief? Fare you well. Had you such a loss as I could not give better comfort than you do. I will not keep this form upon my head, when there is such disorder in my wit. O Lord, my boy, my Arthur, my fair son, my life, my joy, my food, my all the world." End quote. Some have also questioned if other works by William were influenced by Hamnet's death. In his play Twelfth Night, the character Viola believes that her twin brother Sebastian is dead, but in the end she finds out that he is alive. In The Tempest, the character Alonso expresses grief over his son's death. In Julius Caesar, Caesar takes Mark Antony as his adopted son to replace his dead son. In William's Sonnet 37, he wrote, quote, "As a decrepit father takes delight to see his active child do deeds of youth, so I, made lame by fortune's dearest spite, take all my comfort of thy worth and truth." End quote. William was a very prolific writer. I will be mentioning more of his work this episode, but just like what I did last week with the Leonardo da Vinci episode, I will not be listing all of his work because that would take a long time. But I will be bringing up some important works, and later on, I am even going to be analyzing some of his work because I think that it is important to do that to show you how William fits into this season's theme. I'm actually really excited about that. The English major inside of me is absolutely buzzing. William wrote quite a lot of plays in his day, and they ranged from dramas to comedies to historical plays. Richard III, Henry VI, Titus Andronicus, The Comedy of Errors, The Taming of the Shrew, and The Two Gentlemen of Verona were probably some of William's earliest work. But it's hard to say exactly when these works were written. It was very common for playwrights of William's time to collaborate with each other, and critics agree that this was something that William did mostly in his early days of his career as well as the later days of his career. After William wrote the play Richard II entirely in verse in the late 1590s, he introduced prose comedy to his historical plays. The 1590s ended with William writing one of his most famous plays, Romeo and Juliet, among other works. The early 17th century saw William writing what is known as the problem plays, and what those are plays that mix comedy with tragedy. Examples of these are Measure for Measure, Troilus and Cressida, and All's Well That Ends Well. William wrote a total of 38 plays in his life. Some of his more famous plays that I have not mentioned yet are A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Merchant of Venice, Much Ado About Nothing, As You Like It, Hamlet, Othello, that is my personal favorite William Shakespeare play, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, and Henry VIII. The performance of the last play that I said was responsible for the fire of the Globe Theatre. The Globe Theatre was where William had his plays performed. On June 29th, 1613, the play titled All Is True, known today as the play Henry VIII, was performed at the Globe Theatre. Near the end of Act 1, cannons were fired to mark King Henry VIII's entrance. Material from one of the cannons that was on fire landed on the roof of the theater. 2 men were burned in the fire, but no lives were lost. But the Globe Theater was gone within about an hour, and so was a house that was next door to the theater. Another place where William performed was at the court of History Shelf alumni Queen Elizabeth I. Though he performed for her, there is no evidence that William and Elizabeth were besties. I think that gets portrayed a lot, but there's no evidence to support this. But plays were not the only thing that William wrote. He also wrote sonnets. He wrote a lot of sonnets. In fact, he wrote 154 of them. He also wrote 2 long narrative poems and a few other minor poems. His sonnets are actually what has led some to believe that William may have been bisexual. And we are about to dive in to see why people think that. It is possible that during William's time in London, he had affairs with other women. John Manningham, a lawyer that was in London during William's time, wrote in his diary that William had a brief affair during a performance of William's play Richard III. Now, John's entry in his diary is the only account we have to this affair, so this should not be taken as an absolute fact. It is also possible that the author Henry Willoughby may have mentioned an affair that William had in his poem Willoughby, his Avisa. The poem makes a reference to William's narrative poem, The Rape of Lucrece. The greatest evidence that we have to William possibly having extramarital affairs with women is the fact that he wrote 26 sonnets that are love poems addressed to a married woman known as Dark Lady. The Dark Lady shows up in his sonnets 127 through 152. These sonnets are very sexual in nature. The first 8 lines of the sonnet 151 are, quote, "Love is too young to know what conscience is. Yet who knows not conscience is born of love? Then, gentle cheater, urge not my amiss. Least guilty of my faults thy sweet self prove. For thou betraying me, I do betray my nobler part to my gross body's treason. My soul doth tell my body that he may triumph in love. Flesh stays no farther reason." End quote. We know that he is talking about a woman here because he goes on to say later in the sonnet, quote, "Her love for whose dear love I rise and fall." End quote. People have tried to figure out who this Dark Lady was. Historian and writer A.L. Rose has made the claim that the Dark Lady was Amelia Lanier. Amelia was a poet. She was the mistress of Lord Hudson, the Queen's Chamberlain. She was also Italian. Many have dismissed this theory, though. A.L. Rose based his theory off of his study of astrologer Simon Forman's journal entries, and he misread the text, and he thought that Simon had described Amelia as being brown in youth, and it really said brave in youth. An expert on Shakespeare named G.B. Harrison proposed that a woman that owned a brothel that went by Black Luce was the Dark Lady. She had connections with the London theater scene, but there's no proof that she had a connection with William. Some have suggested that the Dark Lady was the wife of John Florio. John was an Italian linguist, and his wife was either named possibly Aileen or Avisa. Mary Fitton has been speculated as being the Dark Lady. She was the mistress of William Herbert, 3rd Earl of Pembroke. This theory first came about in 1890, but in 1897, a portrait of Mary was found, and she had fair skin, so that theory was abandoned. Elizabeth Vernon was married to William Herbert, and she has also been suggested to have been the Dark Lady. So has Jacqueline Field. She was the wife of William's friend and publisher, Richard Field. The only reason behind this suggestion is the fact that Jacqueline was French, so she probably had dark eyes and a darker complexion. Jeanette or Jane Davenant has also been thrown out there as possibly being the Dark Lady. She was the wife of a tavern keeper between London and Stratford. The poet William Davenant claimed to be the illegitimate son of Jeanette and William. There's also another theory out there that there was no real Dark Lady, and she was purely fictional. While some have used some of William's sonnets to suggest that William had an affair with a woman, others have used other sonnets to suggest that he had an affair with a man. 126 love poems by William Shakespeare were published in 1609, and these poems may have been published without William's approval. These love poems are dedicated to someone only known as Mr. W.H. These poems are addressed to a young man known as Fair Lord or Fair Youth. There is definitely desire expressed in these sonnets, though some have argued that these sonnets are not as sexually charged as the Dark Lady sonnets. But let's take a look for ourselves and see what we think. In Sonnet 13, William calls this fair lord his dear. He says, quote, "Oh, none but unthrifts dear my love you know," end quote. In Sonnet 5, he expresses how he fears about the fair youth aging and he wants to preserve his beauty. This isn't the only time that he talks about the fair youth's beauty. In Sonnet 17, he says that he is so beautiful that he cannot possibly be from earth. He says, quote, This pot lies, such heavenly touches never touched earthly faces. End quote. In Sonnet 20, he calls the fair lord the master mistress of his passion. And I'm sure you have probably heard these lines from Sonnet 18. He says, quote, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" End quote. Professor Sir Stanley Wells even thinks that some of these sonnets may be alluding to William being in a throuple. He signals out sonnets 40 and 41 to support this claim. In sonnet 40, it says, quote, "Take all my loves, my love, yeah, take them all." And he says, quote, "Then if for my love thou my love receivest," end quote. In sonnet 41, he talks about the beauty of both his female and male love interest. He says, quote, "Hers by thy beauty tempting her to thee, thine by thy beauty being false to me," end quote. But despite all these examples that I just gave you, there are still people that say the fair lord sonnets are just expressing intense platonic friendship. So they were just really good friends. Again, we have another example of a person from history that could have possibly been LGBTQIA, but people want to shrug off the evidence of this as him just having a really good friend. But to be fair, we don't know for sure that William was in fact bisexual. So I will leave you with one more example from his fair lord sonnets, and I will let you decide what you think about William's sexuality. This example comes from sonnet 52, quote, "So is the time that keeps you as my chest, or as the wardrobe which the robe doth hide, to make some special instant special blessed, by new unfolding his imprisoned pride," end quote. Now, in Elizabethan, the word pride was a euphemism for an erect penis. So, dear listener, you decide if William was talking about a sexual relationship or just a really, really good friend. Now, as I said last week on the Leonardo da Vinci episode, it is not entirely fair to come to a conclusion about a person's life solely based on their art. And I still believe that. If the Dark Lady could possibly be fictional, then why can't the Fair Lord? Well, I think he could be. I think that a person can write about sexual desire for a fictional person of a gender, and the writer could have no desire for that gender. I think it is always important to remember that the writer is not necessarily the narrator. But I think it is also important to remember that he dedicated these sonnets to a Mr. H.W. So, let's just say for a moment that William was in fact bisexual, and he was writing with a man in mind. Then that leads to the question, who was this man? Well, there are a few candidates. The first candidate is a person that I have already mentioned on this episode, and that is William Herbert, 3rd Earl of Pembroke. William Herbert was a patron of the arts. He was a patron of Shakespeare. Shakespeare also wrote Herbert urging him to marry Elizabeth Cary, and of course his initials are W.H. The other possible candidate is Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton. In 1593, William dedicated his narrative poem Venus and Adonis to Henry. He also dedicated his narrative poem The Rape of Lucrece to Henry in 1594. Here is the dedication in The Rape of Lucrece, quote, "The love I dedicate to your lordship is without end. What I have done is yours. What I have to do is yours. Being a part in all I have, devoted yours." End quote. It has been theorized that Henry's initials were reversed by the publisher to keep Henry's identity a secret. Henry's stepfather, William Hervey, 1st Baron Hervey, has also been thrown out there as the potential Mr. W.H. But of course, even if one of these were the Mr. W.H., doesn't automatically mean that they were the fair lord, because writers would often dedicate their works to their patrons. William's writing has caused people to speculate about other aspects of his life, not just his sexuality. People have speculated about his religion as well. I first need to explain to you the religious climate of England during this time. I explained this more in depth in the whole first season of History Shelf, but I'm going to gloss over it really quickly in case you need a refresher or you haven't listened to the first season. So, King Henry VIII was the King of England, and he was Catholic. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, and she was also Catholic. And then he decided that he didn't want to be married to her, and instead he wanted to be married to Anne Boleyn. The Pope said to Henry, "No, I will not annul your marriage to Catherine." Henry was then like, "Fine, I don't need you anyways. I'm going to do what I want. I am the captain now, and what I want to do is leave Catherine and marry Anne." So Henry broke away from the church and told the Pope that they were never ever getting back together. Henry then declared himself the head of the Church of England. He annulled his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and then he married Anne Boleyn, and they had a daughter and named her Elizabeth. Elizabeth went on to become Queen Elizabeth I, and that was who the reigning monarch was for most of William's life. Elizabeth was not Catholic. She belonged to the Church of England. She was the head of the Church of England, and a law was passed that made Catholicism illegal. What I just went over was way more complicated than as I just described it, but that is the Cliff Notes version of it. Now, to the outside world, William was a member of the Church of England. He was married in the Church of England. His children were baptized in the Church of England, and that is where he is buried. And his will used a Protestant formula. But people have wondered if he was secretly a Catholic. William's mother's family was Catholic. It's possible that William's father signed a Catholic statement of faith. It was found in John Shakespeare's rafters in his house in 1757, but it has since been lost, so there is no way to authenticate it. In 1591, John did miss church, and his excuse was for fear of process for debt. So he wanted to avoid going to jail for failing to repay a debt. And this was a common excuse that Catholics used for missing church. In 1606, William's daughter Susanna did not attend communion in Stratford on Easter, but that could have been because she was a Puritan and not a Catholic. Now going back to William's wedding, it was performed in the Church of England, but it may have been officiated by someone who was secretly a Catholic priest. People have turned to William's work to find clues about his religion. In Henry IV, William satirized the Protestant martyr. Hamlet's ghost is in purgatory, a Catholic belief. His poem, The Phoenix and the Turtle, seems to be sympathetic towards Catholicism, and Twelfth Night seems to be sympathetic to the Jesuit priest Edmund Campion. Some have argued that his work is not enough to prove that he was a Catholic, because he also used paganism in his work, like the pagan gods he writes about in King Lear, As You Like It, and many other works. Some have gone so far as to say that William was an atheist. Some have argued that there are anti-religious sentiments in William's work. William John Birch, an English writer, brought this up in 1848. George Orwell wrote in 1947 that William's later tragedies are not Christian. Russian Shakespeare scholar Vadim Nikolaev said that anti-church ideas can be found in William's work, and that he put forward the idea that suicide was not a sin. The Dean brought forth his ideas in 2008, and many have disagreed with him. Something that also may be a mystery to us is what William looked like. Now, I know you were probably saying, now wait, Courtney, I have seen portraits of William Shakespeare before. And you probably have seen portraits that someone is claiming to be William Shakespeare. But no physical description has been found of William, and there's no evidence of William ever having a portrait commissioned. So those portraits claiming to be William Shakespeare may not actually be him. Another controversy surrounding William is, did he really write the works that are accredited to him? Now, when I say this is controversial, I mean it. Like I said earlier, I was an English major, and so I know some English scholars will not even entertain the idea of it and will get absolutely furious about this. So, this theory started around 230 years after William's death, and the theory is that everything that William wrote was actually written by another person or persons. So, the theory is that there was a ghost writer or writers. The theory is the real writer or writers didn't want their identity known due to their social rank or gender. Before I go any farther, I want to say that this theory is not widely believed at all. I personally do not believe it, but I'm still going to tell you about it. The reason why a lot of people will get angry about this theory is because people have come up with this theory because of William's humble origins. So basically, William was too poor and not educated enough to have been able to have written these works, which to me just sounds like elitist bullshit. You will never hear me advocating for someone to have less education, but I don't think that you need to have education to have talent. Can it help? Sure. But raw talent does count for something, and even poor people can be talented. But the people that believe in this theory believe it's because we can't prove William's education. Like I said earlier, we know for sure that he didn't go to a university, and we don't even know for sure if he went to grammar school. And the author of these works, their vocabulary is in between 17,500 to 29,000 words. And some believe that William was illiterate or barely literate, because there has been no letters or signed manuscripts of William's that have been found. There are 6 authenticated signatures that have survived, and the people that believe this theory, they call his signatures an illiterate scrawl, but he was using writing in secretary hand. That was a style of handwriting that was common to William's era. And half of the signatures used abbreviagraphs to abbreviate his surname. The people that believe this theory, who are called anti-Stratfordians, also point out that he spelled his surname differently in literary and non-literary documents. They bring up that William's will, he mentions nothing of the unpublished work he had. They even have brought up William's funerary monument in Stratford. It is a demi-figure effigy holding a pen in his hand. The earliest printed image of this figure was in 1656, and it looked a lot different than it does today. Some say William was clutching a sack of grain or wool, and it was later altered to keep the identity of the writer a secret. In 1924, M.H. Spillman, an art critic, published a painting of the monument before it was restored in 1748, and it showed that it looks very similar to what it looks like now. But, of course, it didn't convince anyone, because I have found once someone gets something in their head, it's nearly impossible to get it out of their head. The writer Richard Kennedy proposed that perhaps the monument was actually meant to honor William's father. William's father did deal in wool. So, if William Shakespeare didn't write his work, then who did? These plays and poems didn't appear out of thin air. So, do these people that question William's authorship have a theory as to who the author actually was? They do. There are a few candidates that people have put forth. The leading candidate is Sir Francis Bacon. He was a lawyer, philosopher, essayist, and scientist. They have compared his writing to some of William Shakespeare's, and they have found similarities. Some say that some of William's work contains stuff about law that only someone in law would know. Some claim that there are hidden political messages that align with what can be found in Francis's work. Some even claim that there are ciphers that Francis left in William's work that reveal the true identity of the author. Another candidate is Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. He was known to sponsor acting companies. He was a poet and playwright, though while some of his poetry has survived, none of his plays have. He was well educated and he had visited the places where a lot of William's plays are set. Parallels can be found between Edward's life and the works of William. Some marked passages in Edward's Bible show up in William's plays. They say that Edward used William because of his, Edward's, rank. Aristocratic authors could not take credit for writing plays for the stage. Another reason why they say that he did this is because Edward was Queen Elizabeth I's lover, and they had a son together. That son was Henry Riesli, and Edward dedicated Venus and Adonis, the rape of Lucrece, and the sonnets to their son. I talked about how ridiculous the theory that Queen Elizabeth I had a child in the episode that I did on her, but I will say it again. There is no way that Queen Elizabeth I would have been able to have a child in secret. Candidate number 3 is Christopher Marlowe. Christopher was a talented poet and dramatist. He had a similar humble background like William did, but Christopher did go to college. He went to Cambridge University. This theory, the Marlowean theory, is wild. This theory says that Christopher's death on May 30th, 1593 was faked. He was killed on May 30th, 1593, and there are a range of different theories as to why and who killed him that I'm not going to get into because this is not Christopher Marlowe's episode. And I don't have an episode planned for him, though it is possible that he was gay. Though, of course, he or William wouldn't have used that term because, like I say in this season's intro, some of the terms that I am using were not used during these subjects' time, and sexual orientation and sexual identity were not terms used in Elizabethan time. You could have homosexual desires, but you wouldn't call yourself a homosexual back then. But anyway, back to the Marlowean theory. So Christopher's death was faked, and then he chose William as a front so he could continue to write plays. And that is what the theory states. The next candidate is William Stanley, 6th Earl of Derby. Derby financed 2 children's dramas companies in London. His initials were W.S. He was only 3 years older than William Shakespeare. He visited places that William Shakespeare wrote about. He married Elizabeth de Vere. Elizabeth was the granddaughter of William Cecil, and some believe that the inspiration for the character Polonius in Hamlet was William Cecil. Derby was also associated with members of William Shakespeare's acting company, the King's Men. Another bizarre and wild theory, and it may be even more wild than the Christopher Marlowe theory, is that Queen Elizabeth I was the one that wrote these works. The last theory is that one person is not responsible for these works, but rather multiple people are. The possible group responsible has been speculated to have been Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Francis Bacon, Edmund Spenser, Lord Buckhurst, and Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. Or Francis Bacon, Edward de Vere, Walter Raleigh, William Stanley, 6th Earl of Derby, Christopher Marlowe, Mary Sidney, Countess of Pembroke, and Roger Manners, 5th Earl of Rutland. Or Edward de Vere, Francis Bacon, Roger Manners, William Herbert, and Mary Sidney. Or perhaps Christopher Marlowe, Robert Greene, and Thomas Nash. Though if Robert Greene was responsible, I don't know why he would have went after William for his writing. That makes no sense. Unless those that believe this theory think that Robert did that to throw people off. I don't know. But like I said earlier, most do not believe the theory that William Shakespeare the actor was just a front. Other playwrights of the time had similar humble origin stories, and their authorship has not been called into question. Francis Mears, an author during William's time, said that William was one of the authors by whom the quote, English tongue is mighty enriched, end quote. And he listed some of William's works that had not been published yet. William's contemporaries also acknowledged him as the author of his work. William's vocabulary is actually on par with his contemporaries. It only seems larger than other authors of his time because more of his work has survived than that of his contemporaries. William's plays also lack what would normally be seen in plays written by university-taught playwrights of his time. They resemble someone that only had an Elizabethan grammar school education. Profile fitting patterns show that the body of work was written by one person, so that knocks out the group theories. Those patterns were found by a person who was sympathetic to the theory that Edward de Vere was the author, and they used a computer program to find those patterns. That same program compared William's work to 37 authors that had been theorized to have been the true authors of William's work. And the conclusion was that William could not have written the 37 authors' works, and they could not have written his. William's last play that was attributed to him was written in 1613. It has often been said that he retired to Stratford in his later years and never returned to London, but there is evidence that he was in London in his later years. He was still acting in London in 1608, and he visited London during the years 1611 through 1614. William died on April 23, 1616, and if his estimated birthday is right, then that means that he died on his 52nd birthday. The cause of his death is unknown. A month before his death, he wrote his will and described himself as being in perfect health. The vicar of Stratford wrote 50 years after William's death in his notebook that, quote, Shakespeare, Drayton, and Ben Jonson had a merry meeting, and it seems drank too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever there contracted, end quote. William was buried in the chancel of the Holy Trinity Church on April 25, 1616. There is a curse written on his stone slab. This is what it says, translated to modern English. Quote, Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. End quote. He left most of his estate to his oldest daughter, Susanna. Both of his daughters married and had children, but none of William's 4 grandchildren had any children. So William Shakespeare's line died out, and he has no direct descendants living today, though his second sister that was named Joan does. William's legacy is huge. Here we are almost 408 years after his death, and we are still talking about the things that he wrote. His works are taught in schools. I had a class in college that was just dedicated to his work. His writing has had a lasting impact on art. Until Romeo and Juliet, romance was not seen as a topic worthy of a tragedy. William has inspired countless writers for centuries. I think William has to be the most famous writer of all time. He has inspired novelists like Thomas Hardy, William Faulkner, Charles Dickens, Herman Melville, and many others. Scholars have identified 20,000 pieces of music linked to William's work, like Sergei Prokofyev's ballet Romeo and Juliet, and the operas of Macbeth, Othello, and Falstaff were inspired by William's work. I can think of 7 songs right off the top of my head that reference his work. Canadian pop-punk band Marianne and Trench's songs Toy Soldiers and Astoria make a reference to Romeo and Juliet. So does American pop-punk band We the King's song Check Yes Juliet, LMNT's song Juliet, and Taylor Swift's song Love Story also make a reference to Romeo and Juliet. And Taylor Swift's song All Too Well 10-minute version makes a reference to All's Well That Ends Well, and so does her song Lover. I am sure all of his plays have been turned into movies. His plays have been adapted for a modern audience in movies. 10 Things I Hate About You, that is an adaptation of Taming of the Shrew. The 2001 teen movie Get Over It is an adaptation of A Midsummer's Night Dream, and West Side Story is an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. His work has inspired paintings. I could go on and list all of the adaptations of his work and the work that he has inspired, but that would take far too long. But if you ever have the time, Google William Shakespeare adaptations. I can guarantee that you have seen at least one of them, even if you didn't know that it was a William Shakespeare adaptation. Guinness World Records say that William is the world's best-selling playwright. His sales are believed to have achieved in excess of 4 billion copies, and he is the 3rd most translated author in history. He is only behind Jules Verne and Agatha Christie. And that was the life of William Shakespeare. Thank you so much for listening to the 4th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf. I am going to be covering 15 people this season, but I have no idea how many episodes that's going to take. Next week's episode is going to be about King James VI and First. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. The Instagram is at History_Shelf_pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. The one that I'm most active on is TikTok. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Stuff merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a shout out to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of the episode I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month, and with that you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month, and with that you get the first 2 tiers. Plus, you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers. Plus, you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want, except for the zip-up hoodie. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. Also, if you click on one of the affiliated links, there's one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and there's one for Bookshop. If you click on one of those links and you buy something, that also helps support the podcast. But as always, the best way that you can support this podcast is to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.